In 2005, Raghuram Rajan, then director of research at the IMF, spoke in Jackson Hole and warned the gathering of economists of growing risks in the financial system. 3 years later, the global financial crisis had the world's economy paralyzed. Dr. Rajan later served as the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, is now at the University of Chicago, and is out with a new book called The Third Pillar: How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind, and he joins us now. So I want to start with an idea you outlined earlier in the book of markets and the community as existing on opposite ends of a spectrum or a continuum. And I guess I would ask, do you see the idea of community and the market as in tension with one another? And basically the thesis of the book is we've started to lose our sense of community in this modern economy.
Well, there is a fundamental tension between markets and the community, right? Take for example, the fact that markets offer us a lot of choice. But what choice does is it breaks community ties. Today, if I want to have my child born, I go to a hospital. In the past, you went to your neighbor to help out as a midwife and so on. That breaks ties. We don't need the neighbor anymore. We use the hospital. We use professional services. If today I want to buy something at the shop, I order online. I don't bother to ask my 80-year-old neighbor whether she needs to go to the shop and whether I can take her there. So that's the sense in which markets do tend to attack community ties. And there's a constant battle to preserve the community in the face of those choices.
Yeah, so you talk about this information communications technology revolution, and you talk about this community being left behind of those three pillars: community, markets, and state. Then what is your idea to bolster the community and to integrate it with those two other pillars?
Absolutely. One of the problems with globalization is that increasingly, as markets become global, governance also becomes global. Take, for example, bank capital. It used to be determined at the city level. Then it became determined at the state level. Then it became the national level. Today we determine it in Basel for the entire world. Right. What we need is to bring some of those powers back, first to the nation, then back to the region, and then finally back to the community, so that people have a sense of agency. When they're hit by these global forces, they really have very little ability to respond today because there is fairly little power, fairly little funding, and often not the right people in the community because many have left some of these failing communities.
Now, how would you do that practically speaking? Now, what would be an example?
First, send powers back. So take back powers first to the country and then back into the region. That's one. So, for example, the power to look after your schools. Today, so the school curriculum has moved up into the state level and into the national level. Can we give some of it back to the community so that parents feel engaged in that process of determining what their kids learn? That's one part of it. But apart from power, giving funding back. That today, if you want to determine what happens in your community, basically you've got to appeal at the state level because there's nothing that you really can do in a big way at the local level, especially in these failing communities.
Yeah, now I think what's interesting, if you look at the economic moment right now, especially here in the U.S., we have Bernie Sanders and AOC talking about MMT, right? Big government spending programs. And I feel like that's a response, right, to the crisis. We're still living in a crisis moment. I think Adam Tooze outlined that quite well in his book last year. And I guess it sort of is like, do we want more government, right, of a different kind, or do we just need to abandon that? Because another theme in the book is that when we went to the 80s Thatcher-Reagan model, you weren't more free with more market, right? You actually were kind of enslaved by that market.
I think what we need to do is allow decision-making back to the people to some extent. And that means decentralize a lot more than we have today. Because regions and communities are very differently affected. New York City flourishing in many parts, not so much Long Island City and Queens, but many parts of New York City flourishing as a result of globalization. Galena or Steel City, Illinois, not so well. So each place needs to determine how it responds. And decentralizing is going to be far more effective than some grand central bank. This doesn't mean that the government has no role, but it has to move to a more supportive role. In some sense, the problem is the same as the problem of development. When we try to figure out which countries should develop, and we tell them, do this, this, and this, it never worked. But once there was internal agency, once those countries figured out, we want to move, then support helped. But that it has to come from inside. And I think there are many examples of communities which have rebuilt themselves based on internal leadership and an internal urge to change. And there are examples in India, in the US, many of them, and also across the world.
Right now, it seems like we're talking a lot about the government and politics, but in some ways, big tech is just as powerful as governments around the world. And I mean, what do we do about regulating firms like your Facebooks or your Googles? Because they seem to have a role in this as well.
They do. And part of what is going on, of course, is that increasingly superstar firms are dominating industrial economies. And they're creating superstar jobs, but they appeal to a few, not to everyone. I think there is a worry when the economy gets dominated by a few firms. The interesting part is these firms are providing very good services. So we have to be careful that at the same time as we try and limit their influence, they still have the ability to provide the kind of services they're providing. So we have to be cleverer in terms of how we regulate. For example, if you're regulating big tech, two of the areas which I think are worth exploring, one, who owns the data? Could it be that we push the ownership of data back to the people who generate it, that is the individual? This is something California is thinking about. This is an interesting proposal. Second, because of network externalities, these networks get enormous power. You're on Facebook because everybody else is on Facebook. Could it be that you allow interoperability of networks? So make it such that some small entity can also have access to the Facebook network. Then you really get competition, because now the network externality that Facebook possesses becomes available to all. That's the way you create competition in this kind of environment.
And just to wrap up quickly, changing gears a little bit, got to ask you about Jay Powell, first year at the Fed, just about wrapping up. He, of course, has a not an academic background. What do you make of his first year as Fed chair, and just the notion that the leader of the Federal Reserve is not by training a PhD economist?
Well, I don't think that matters that much. I think what matters is that you have the intellectual heft to be able to appreciate what needs to be done. I think he has that in great measure. I would say this has been a difficult year, given what's happening in the global economy and given what's happening domestically. After all, you have a president who is fairly volatile in terms of policy making. So in that sense, I think the Fed has navigated that with the best of its ability. I think going forward, I think it'll be interesting to see his commentary tomorrow and how he explains the shift in the Fed position that has taken place and how he assures markets on what he's going to do going forward.
All right. Raghuram Rajan, the book is called The Third Pillar. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you very much.